The Canon EOS sat in the pawn shop window for 3 weeks before Maya noticed it. She walked past Riverside Pawn every day on her way to the coffee shop where she worked, usually too preoccupied with thoughts of rent and student loans to pay attention to the dusty displays of guitars, jewelry and electronics that filled the storefront. But something about the camera caught her eye. That Tuesday morning in October, maybe the way light hit its lens, maybe just timing, maybe fate working in ways she'd spend months trying to understand. The price tag said $200, which was exactly what she'd saved from tips over the past 2 months. She'd been wanting to upgrade from phone photography, had been following professional photographers on social media with a mixture of admiration and envy, had convinced herself that good equipment would somehow transform her casual hobby into something more serious. The pawn shop owner, a man whose name tag read Jerry, told her the camera had come in 2 months ago, that the previous owner had needed cash quickly and hadn't returned to reclaim it. He demonstrated that it worked, showed her the battery compartment and memory card slot, offered her a 30-day return policy if she found any problems. Maya handed over her carefully accumulated tips and walked out with the camera in a worn, padded bag, feeling a mixture of excitement and guilt about the purchase. She spent her lunch break that day reading through the manual, learning the settings, taking test shots of the cafe's interior. The camera felt substantial in her hands, professional, like it meant business. When she got home that evening, she connected it to her laptop to transfer the test photos. That's when she discovered the previous owner hadn't erased the memory card. There were 237 photographs stored in the camera's internal memory, dated from March through August of the previous year. Maya knew she should delete them, that they were someone else's private moments, but curiosity won. She clicked on the first image, expecting vacation photos or family snapshots. What she saw instead made her breath catch and her finger freeze over the delete button. Before we explore what was in those photographs and why they would upend everything Maya thought she knew about her city, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single moment of this story. Drop a like if you're already hooked and leave a comment telling me what country and city you're watching from. I love seeing our global community come together over stories that blur the line between coincidence and conspiracy. There's something uniquely unsettling about inheriting someone else's perspective, literally seeing through their eyes via images they captured and then abandoned. Photography is supposed to be about memory, about preserving moments worth keeping, so when someone leaves behind an entire camera full of photos, it suggests either carelessness or urgency, either that the images didn't matter or that they mattered too much. Maya Chen had always been drawn to mysteries, had grown up reading detective novels and watching true crime documentaries, analyzing evidence and constructing theories with an enthusiasm her friends found both amusing and slightly concerning. She'd chosen journalism as her major in college, had dreams of investigative reporting that had been gradually eroded by the realities of a struggling industry and mounting student debt. The coffee shop job was supposed to be temporary, a way to pay bills while she figured out her next move. But temporary had stretched into 2 years with no clear endpoint in sight. She was 26, living in a city that felt simultaneously full of opportunity and completely indifferent to her existence, watching friends from college buy houses and get promoted while she perfected latte art and smiled at customers who didn't bother learning her name. The camera felt like a step toward something, a tool that might help her create the kind of work that would open doors, even if she wasn't entirely sure which doors or what she'd do once they opened. She'd imagined starting a photography blog, maybe doing freelance work for local publications, building a portfolio that demonstrated skills her journalism degree had promised, but never quite delivered. The first photograph showed a street corner she recognized immediately, the intersection of 5th and Broadway, right in the middle of downtown, one of the busiest pedestrian areas in the city. The image was taken at night. the timestamp reading 11:47 p.m. on March 15th. Nothing unusual about the scene itself. People walking, cars passing, storefronts lit up, except for one detail that jumped out at her. In the background, barely visible in the frame's edge, two men stood in an alley. One was handing something to the other, and even in the photograph's poor lighting, the transaction looked furtive, deliberate, wrong. Maya clicked to the next image. Same intersection, 2 minutes later, but the photographer had zoomed in on the alley. The men's faces were clearly visible now, and what was being exchanged was unmistakable. A thick envelope, the kind you'd use for cash or documents you wanted to keep flat and protected. The man receiving the envelope wore a suit that looked expensive, even in the grainy night photography. The man handing it over wore casual clothes and an expression of barely concealed anxiety. Maya took a screenshot of their faces and moved to the next photo. This one was from a different night, different location, a parking garage downtown, the timestamp showing April 2nd at 10:15 p.m. The same two men, another exchange, this time accompanied by a third person whose face was turned away from the camera. She clicked through more images, her heart rate accelerating. March through August, dozens of photographs documenting what appeared to be regular meetings between these men at various locations throughout the city. Parking garages, alleys, parks after dark, a boat marina, even once in broad daylight at a farmer's market, though that exchange was more subtle, just a brief handshake that could have been innocent if not for the context of all the other images. Maya's journalism training kicked in. She opened a new document and started taking notes, dates, locations, descriptions of what each photograph showed. She organized the images into folders by location and created a timeline. The meetings followed a pattern every 2 weeks, alternating between 5 different locations, always involving the same man in the expensive suit. The photographer had been systematic, documenting each exchange from multiple angles, sometimes following the subjects after the handoff to capture where they went next. This wasn't casual photography. This was surveillance, evidence gathering, the work of someone building a case. Maya zoomed in on the best image of the man in the suit and ran it through a reverse image search. The results made her stomach drop. Richard Castellano, city council member, head of the Urban Development Committee, frequent subject of local news coverage about downtown revitalization projects. She recognized him now, had probably seen his face dozens of times in the newspaper and on television without paying much attention. He was married, 2 kids, always photographed at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and community events. The kind of politician who specialized in looking earnest and committed to public service. The images on this camera told a different story. She searched for information about Castellano's committee work and found several articles about controversial development deals that had been approved over the past year despite community opposition. A historic neighborhood had been rezoned for commercial use. Environmental protections had been waived for a waterfront construction project. A public park had been sold to private developers. Each decision had been close, and in each case, Castellano's vote had been decisive. Maya looked at the timeline she'd created and felt pieces clicking into place. The first photograph was dated 2 weeks before a major zoning vote. Subsequent meetings aligned with other controversial decisions. Someone had been paying Castellano, and someone else had been documenting it, and now Maya was holding the evidence in a camera she'd bought for $200 at a pawn shop. She should take this to the police. That was the obvious choice, the responsible citizen approach. But Maya had covered enough local government stories during her college internship to know how these things worked. Evidence could disappear, investigations could stall. People with power had ways of protecting themselves. She thought about the original photographer, about why they'd abandoned this camera with its damning contents. Had they been scared off, paid off, something worse? She searched for recent news about investigations into city council corruption and found nothing. searched for unusual deaths or disappearances that might connect, and found too many to pass through without more information. The photographs themselves didn't identify the photographer. No selfies, no reflections in windows or mirrors that might show who was behind the lens. She checked the camera's settings for GPS data and found it had been disabled. Whoever had taken these photos had been careful about their own anonymity while meticulously documenting their subjects. Maya sat at her kitchen table until past midnight, going through the images again and again, trying to decide what to do. Her small apartment felt different now, charged with a significance it hadn't held that morning. She'd woken up as a barista, with artistic aspirations. She was going to bed as someone in possession of evidence that could potentially topple a city council member and expose corruption in the development committee. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy in her chest, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. She finally decided on a compromise. She'd do more research, try to understand the full scope of what she was looking at, and then she'd figure out the safest way to make the information public. She had journalism training, even if she'd never used it professionally. She knew how to verify sources, how to build a story, how to present evidence in a way that would be taken seriously. The photographer had done the hard work of gathering the documentation. Maya could do the work of exposing it. The next morning, she called in sick to work, which she never did, and spent the day at the public library using their computers to research Richard Castellano and the development deals his committee had approved. She created a detailed spreadsheet linking each photographed exchange to specific votes, noting the dates and outcomes. The correlation was undeniable. 2 weeks before approving the waterfront development, Castellano had met his contact at the boat marina. 3 weeks before the historic neighborhood rezoning, there'd been an exchange in a parking garage downtown. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. She researched the man making the payments, using facial recognition software available through a journalism database she still had access to from her student days. His name was Vincent Torres, and he was listed as a consultant for Meridian Development Corporation, one of the largest real estate firms operating in the city. Meridian had been awarded contracts on every controversial project that Castellano's committee had approved. The corruption was almost laughably obvious once you saw the pattern, but without the photographs, it would have been nearly impossible to prove. Vincent Torres was careful. No public social media, minimal online presence, the kind of person who understood how to operate in shadows. Maya spent 3 days gathering information, barely sleeping, living on coffee, and the growing conviction that she'd stumbled into something significant. She reached out to a former professor from her journalism program, explaining in vague terms that she had evidence of municipal corruption and asking for advice about how to proceed. The professor suggested she contact the city newspaper's investigative team, gave her a name and contact information, warned her to be careful about who else she told. On the 4th day, Maya emailed the investigative reporter, a woman named Catherine Price, whose byline appeared on most of the serious investigative pieces the paper published. She didn't send the photographs yet, just a description of what she had and a request to meet. Catherine responded within an hour. They met at a cafe across town, far from Maya's usual neighborhood. Catherine was in her 40s, dressed in business casual, carrying a notebook and wearing an expression of professional skepticism that Maya recognized from every journalism professor she'd ever had. Maya showed her a selection of the photographs on her laptop, explained the timeline, walked her through the connections to Castellano's committee votes. Catherine's skepticism transformed into focused intensity. She asked where Maya had gotten the camera, whether anyone else knew about the photos, whether Maya had told Castellano or Torres that she had them. When Maya said she'd told no one, except her former professor, Catherine nodded approval and said that was smart, that these kinds of investigations required careful handling. She said she wanted to verify everything independently, that the paper's lawyers would need to review the evidence before they could publish anything, that it would take weeks at minimum, possibly months. She also said Maya needed to be prepared for attention she probably didn't want, that whistleblowers rarely got the gratitude they deserved, that powerful people fought back in ways that could be personally and professionally destructive. Maya said she understood, though she wasn't sure she really did. Catherine took copies of the most significant photographs, promising to keep Maya's name out of everything as long as possible, warning her not to discuss the case with anyone else. Maya went home feeling both vindicated and anxious, the adrenaline of the past few days beginning to wear off and leave behind exhaustion. She'd done the right thing. She'd taken evidence of corruption to someone who could actually do something about it. Now she just had to wait. The waiting, it turned out, was worse than the investigation. Weeks passed with only occasional updates from Catherine. The paper's lawyers were reviewing everything. They were corroborating the timeline. They were attempting to locate the original photographer, trying to understand why the camera had been abandoned. Maya tried to return to normal life, showing up for her shifts at the coffee shop, smiling at customers, pretending everything was fine. But she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if Torres or Castellano had somehow learned that their secret exchanges were no longer secret. 2 months after Maya had first contacted her, Catherine called with news. The story was ready to publish. They'd verified everything, had even found additional evidence through their own investigation, had confirmed that several other council members had received payments from Meridian Development through various intermediaries. The scope of the corruption was larger than what Maya's photographs had shown, but those photographs were the key that had unlocked everything else. The story would run in 3 days, on a Sunday, which was when the paper published its most significant investigative pieces. Catherine asked if Maya was prepared for what came next, warned her again that her name would eventually become public despite their efforts to protect her anonymity, suggested she might want to stay with friends or family for a few days after publication. Maya said she'd be fine, though she wasn't certain. The story broke exactly as Catherine had promised, a front-page investigation spanning 6 full pages with dozens of photographs, including many from Maya's camera. The headline read, "Bought Votes, How Meridian Development Corrupted City Council." The response was immediate and explosive. By Monday morning, federal investigators had announced they were opening a criminal investigation. Castellano had resigned from the council and hired a lawyer. Torres had disappeared, his apartment cleaned out, no forwarding address. Other council members named in the investigation were holding press conferences proclaiming their innocence. The mayor was calling for a complete audit of all development deals approved in the past 3 years. Maya's phone started ringing with interview requests, which she ignored on Catherine's advice. For a week, she stayed in her apartment, watching the fallout unfold on television and social media, feeling simultaneously proud and terrified. She'd done it. She'd exposed corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. But she'd also made powerful enemies, and she had no idea what consequences that might bring. The knock on her door came 10 days after the story published. 2 FBI agents, credentials held up to her peephole, asking to speak with her about the photographs. She let them in, answered their questions, explained again how she'd bought the camera and what she'd found. They were professional, almost bored, treating her like a witness rather than a suspect. They asked if she'd kept copies of everything, whether she'd noticed anyone following her, whether anyone had contacted her to pressure her into silence. She said yes to the copies, no to everything else. They gave her a card with a phone number to call if anything changed, thanked her for her cooperation, and left. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal, though Maya found she'd changed in ways she was still cataloguing. She quit her job at the coffee shop, used some of the freelance payment Catherine had arranged for her as a consultant on the investigation to cover rent while she looked for journalism work. The story had become her portfolio, the kind of clips that opened doors she'd previously thought locked. 3 newspapers and 2 digital media outlets offered her interviews. She accepted a position as a junior investigative reporter at the city paper, working under Catherine, learning how to do properly what she'd stumbled into by accident. Richard Castellano pleaded guilty to bribery charges 6 months later and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Vincent Torres was eventually located in Mexico and extradited to face charges. Meridian Development Corporation declared bankruptcy under the weight of lawsuits and criminal penalties. The city council restructured its ethics oversight, though Maya remained cynical about whether rules would change behavior. She'd seen too much, knew too intimately how corruption worked, understood that for every scheme exposed, others continued in darkness. But she'd also learned that evidence mattered, that documentation could topple powerful people, that sometimes ordinary citizens stumbled into situations that demanded extraordinary action. She kept the camera even though it had become famous, even though collectors and museums had offered to buy it. She kept it because it represented a turning point, the moment her life had pivoted from aimless to purposeful, from observer to participant. She still didn't know who the original photographer had been. Despite extensive investigation by both the FBI and the newspaper, that person's identity remained a mystery. Whoever they were, they'd risked significant danger to document the corruption, then had apparently decided the risk was too great and had abandoned the evidence rather than face whatever consequences exposure might bring. Maya thought about them often, wondered if they were relieved or frustrated that someone else had finished what they'd started, whether they felt vindicated that their work hadn't been wasted. She hoped they felt proud. They'd done the hard part. Maya had just been lucky enough to find their work and brave enough to see it through. A year after buying the camera, Maya received an envelope at the newspaper's office. No return address, postmarked from a city 3 states away. Inside was a brief handwritten note. "Thank you for having the courage I lacked. I watched them for 6 months before I realized they knew I was watching. I had to run, had to leave everything behind, including the evidence I'd gathered. I pawned the camera in a different city, hoping someone would find the photos and do something with them. I never imagined anyone actually would. You gave those photographs meaning and purpose. You finished what I started. I'm proud of you, and I'm grateful. Stay safe, stay brave." No signature, no identifying information, but Maya knew it was from the original photographer. She kept that note with the camera, 2 pieces of a larger story about ordinary people doing difficult things, about evidence that refused to stay buried, about truth working its way toward light through whatever channels it could find. She continued her investigative journalism work, focusing on local government and development corruption, using the skills she'd learned from Catherine and the instincts she'd discovered she possessed. Not every story she pursued had the impact of the Castellano investigation, but each one mattered to someone. Each piece of exposed corruption represented a small victory for accountability over power. The camera stayed on her desk, a reminder that sometimes the most important stories find you rather than the other way around, that paying attention to details matters, that curiosity can lead to consequences far beyond what you imagine when you first click the shutter, or in her case, when you first click through someone else's photographs and realize you're looking at something that was never meant to be seen. She bought the camera hoping to change her life through the images she would create. Instead, it changed her life through images someone else had already captured, through evidence that had been waiting for exactly the right person to find it and have the courage to share it. Maya had been that person, and though the journey had been terrifying and complicated and occasionally overwhelming, she wouldn't have traded it for anything. The camera had given her purpose. The photographs had given her direction. The courage to act on what she'd found had given her a career and a conviction that the work mattered. Some things, it turned out, you weren't meant to see, but once you'd seen them, You had a responsibility to decide what kind of person you wanted to be, the kind who looked away, or the kind who looked closer and refused to let important truths stay hidden. Maya had chosen to look closer, and that choice had defined everything that came after.